Now for Detroit, the motherland is Canada. That's how we started. We were not founded or established by a group of Englishmen sailing across the Atlantic. They didn't venture up the St. Lawrence. We were founded and established by the French, and the colony they created, of which we were a part, was called Canada. And Cadillac is not only the name of a car, it's also the name of an explorer who arrived in 1701 and founded Fort Pontchartrain du Détroit. So the Fort of Detroit, it was part of French Canada. Our major connections from the beginning of our history in Detroit was not with Washington, D.C. Our major contact was with Montreal. And in fact, that's where the people came from. They came to Montreal, and then from Montreal they came down to Detroit. Our government was up there in Quebec. And in fact, the language that was spoken here, you can tell it from many of the streets in Detroit, including Detroit, which are mispronounced. They spoke French. So we were intimately a part of Canada. And even when the British came in 1760 and defeated the French and took Quebec and took Montreal and finally arrived at Fort Detroit and took Fort Detroit, we were part of the British colony of Canada. Canada became part of British North America. And in fact, when the American Revolution took place, the American revolutionaries never got here. They couldn't. There was a British army here. Detroit was one of the major places for the British resistance to the American revolutionaries. This was the major center for capturing Americans and scalping them. Many American scalps passed through Fort Detroit. I mean, Colonel Hamilton, who was here, who was the British officer, I mean, he was the great defender of the Northwest Territories against the Americans. And in 1783, when the Treaty of Paris was signed, they drew the boundary down the middle of the Detroit River, and Fort Detroit ended up on the American side. But despite that fact, we still were part of Canada. The British refused to give up Detroit to the Americans because after the Revolutionary War, 1/3 of the American population, having refused to sign up for the revolution, were hounded and persecuted. They were called the Tories. They were tarred and feathered. You want to talk about the American Civil Liberties Union having a heyday, do you understand? They were tarred and feathered. Their property was taken from them. Close to 50,000 loyalist refugees fled their American home. They were driven out because they were loyal to their king and loyal to their government. They thought they were patriots. They were driven out, and close to 50,000 of them crossed over to the one British colony, or one of two, that the American revolutionaries couldn't take. They couldn't take Nova Scotia, and they couldn't take Canada. At that time, they were separate colonies. They remained in British hands. And so the Loyalists poured over, and the British government said to the Americans, "We will not surrender Detroit to you until you pay money to compensate what you did to the Loyalists." So in 1783, Detroit never joined the United States of America. It was still part of Canada. In 1791, the British decided to divide Canada into two parts. Lower Canada, which became the ancestor of Quebec, and Upper Canada, which had almost no people except in Detroit, which later on became Ontario. And in fact, in 1791, the first election was held in Detroit, ever held in Detroit. It was a Canadian election. That is, Detroiters were asked to vote for a representative to the new Parliament of Upper Canada, which was meeting in a town that was just created. It's very familiar to people doing summer tourism. It was called Newark. It's now called Niagara-on-the-Lake. That's why it's a lovely little British colonial capital you love to go to. So the first election resulted in the election of somebody called Macomb. He was one of those French farmers. Did he know he was going to end up with a county? I mean, you know, I mean, there were many families that came later that were much more important, but they didn't come at the what? At the right time. So Monsieur Macomb goes off to Niagara-on-the-Lake, not to see the Shaw Festival, but to attend the first parliamentary meeting. Detroit was part of Canada. It wasn't until 1796 when John Jay, who was to become the first Chief Justice of the American Supreme Court, went to England to negotiate a treaty. It wasn't until then that the British consented to give up Detroit. And so it was in 1796 when mad, he was crazy, not so, mad General Anthony Wayne, and everything's named after him, right? Nobody even knows about him. If I asked you, give me 2 biographical details about Anthony Wayne. We all go around saying Wayne, 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 Wayne University, Wayne County, the whole thing. Well, who knows? And Mr. Macomb, what do we know? So mad General Anthony Wayne now arrives in the area. He sends forward his advance force under Colonel Proctor, and they arrive in 1796, in the summer of 1796, to take down the British flag, to remove Detroit from Canada, and to put up the American flag. When they did, almost all the people in Detroit moved across to Amherstburg. They did not wish to live under the American flag. The French were in particular concerned about the arrival of the Americans because the Americans were aggressive Protestants. And they were afraid that their own Catholic religion would be assaulted by the Americans. So, and the Scots merchants for sure weren't going to stay under the Americans. So they went across and they founded a whole new fort called Fort Malden, which you can go and visit in Amherstburg if you're on your way to Boblo, which is no longer an amusement park. All right, so, and Amherstburg was built as the town next to the fort, which turned into a shipping yard so the British could build a fleet on Lake Erie to prevent the Americans from crossing. So, we were part of Canada. And then, all of a sudden, this border turned hostile. That is, Detroit's on one side of the border, and most of the people who live there are on the other side of the border. Well, the Americans, of course, are very, very ambitious. They failed in the American Revolution to take Canada. They want it. And in fact, they wait for a supreme moment. The supreme moment is around 1812. In 1812, the British are so occupied with fighting the French under Napoleon that they couldn't possibly defend Canada. So it's at that moment that General Hull, a revolutionary hero who has been assigned he's gotten older and fatter, but it's okay, who has now been assigned to Detroit to lead the invasion of Canada, proceeds to invade Canada. And the whole invasion turns out to be an embarrassing disaster. As I have said on other occasions, I went to the Detroit public schools for many years, and I was a good student. I must tell you that nobody told me about the terrible defeat of the Americans in the War of 1812. It was do you remember? No. It's called doctored history for purposes of patriotism. He crossed over and the whole army was defeated by a few hundred British who were left, and leftover Indians, Amerindians, who didn't want the Americans around because the Americans weren't interested in fur, they were interested in bringing settlers. Defeated. And in fact, there's a great tribute. If you go to Niagara-on-the-Lake and you go a little south on your way to Niagara Falls, you'll get to Queenston Heights, and there up on the heights, it's a wonderful restaurant overlooking the river, don't miss it. And there is the statue of General Isaac Brock. He was the great defender, if you will, of Upper Canada against the American invaders. The War of 1812 turned out to be a disaster for the United States of America. Detroit itself was captured and rejoined Canada for a whole year before an American admiral who sailed Lake Erie created an American fleet at Sandusky. Can you imagine this? Cedar Point. Created an American fleet and set sail for Put-in-Bay. And there he met the British fleet coming from Amherstburg. I mean, it was the war zone. His name was Oliver Hazard Perry, and on September the 10th, 1813, he defeated the British fleet, and that made the holding of Detroit impossible for the British. They began retiring, and then the American troops crossed over and followed them all the way almost to London, Ontario, which at that time did not exist. But the river did that goes through London. It's called the Thames, and there on the Thames was fought the famous Battle of the Thames, in which the British were defeated, and a famous Indian leader who cooperated with them was killed. His name was Tecumseh. We have a whole town in Michigan called Tecumseh, which is named after him. He was like Pontiac. He was trying to defend Indian rights, and he felt the British could better do that. Well, despite that, the march on Quebec and Montreal never took place. They tried to cross to take Niagara-on-the-Lake, and a lady who must have made candy called Laura Secord, I don't know. She's the Betsy Ross of Canada, do you understand? With her help, the whole American invasion was a disaster. Canada was not retaken, and in fact the border remained hostile because the American intention was always there. Why not? I mean, doesn't North America belong to us? It should. I mean, why didn't we get Canada in the Revolution? We should have. There were actually, in the Revolution, not 13 colonies. There were 16. In addition to the 13 that made it, there was Canada, there was Nova Scotia, and the British had taken Florida from the Spanish. Well, Florida was given back to the Spanish, and Nova Scotia and Canada now ended up independent, but the boundary, the Detroit River, was a war zone. Hard to believe. Well, and it remained a very, very problematic place, but all I'm saying is the connection of Detroit to Canada. Do you understand? I know we're in the same country as Mississippi. What is our connection to Mississippi? You tell me. I don't even understand sometimes people who come. I mean, I go to Ontario all the time. What would my life be without the Stratford Festival and the Shaw Festival in Toronto? You tell me. When I talk about Detroit, people say, well, what's wonderful about Detroit? I always say it's right next to Canada. No, it's right next to Canada. I mean, that's what makes it so terrific. So, but it was that war zone. And that border, by the way, remained a hostile border because during the Civil War, while much of the British public sympathized with Lincoln and the North, the British government and the British leaders of industry, the cotton industry in particular, favored the Confederacy. They thought they would be able to become the patrons of the Confederacy. They would get cotton cheaper. And so they supported it, and I don't know whether you realize it, there were many forays that came out of Canada from the North. That was the whole plan, to attack the North from the North. So when the Civil War was over, the American government was furious. But over time, the hostile frontier turned friendly. It was simply inevitable. The business future, the economic future of this place up in the north could not lie with Great Britain. Its economic future had to lie with the country that was closest by, with which it could more easily do business. It was the United States of America. So in time, it's interesting how easy it is for people to forget. The hostilities were forgotten, and in fact, when my granduncle first came to Detroit in the 1880s, he used to tell me that, and I'm not sure that I believed him because I couldn't imagine that the whole river froze over. There had to be a channel where the ships could go through. But he used to tell me that you could walk across on a frozen January day. There was no customs official, no passport, nothing. So the hostile frontier turned into a what? A kind of friendly frontier, and you could cross the whole place. And in fact, that's the border that I remember, right? Going to Canada was like going to Ohio. Did you think you were going to a foreign country? No. Did you need a passport? Did you even need a birth certificate? They simply said, where were you born? You said, Detroit. And that was it, through the whole thing. So I mention this because it is so interesting that Detroit has had such a great connection with Canada. And through the years after the border became peaceful, one of the main entry points for Canadians who were moving to the United States of America was Detroit. A large part of the population of the Detroit area has its origin in Canada. How many people in this room have a Canadian origin? There you are. So there you are. They came through, it's one of the major ports of entry, and when Detroit boomed in the 1920s, there were thousands and hundreds of thousands of Canadians looking for good jobs who crossed the Detroit River and came to Detroit. So what is amazing is, given all this connection, how little we know about Canada. See, I can ask Detroiters, who is the Prime Minister of France? Well, they read it, Chirac. I can ask them, who are the major music stars of England? Mention Canada. Surveys have indicated that one way to make an article boring is to put the word Canada in it. If people see Canada, they don't read the article. Is that not amazing? All right. Now, the country of Canada is the second largest country in the world territorially. It has 3,850,000 square miles. most of it frozen, but that doesn't make a difference. If you're just counting area, got it? It's like the Russians. They've got Siberia. You know, most of it is empty, but if you're talking about land, you can look at the map. Almost all the way to the North Pole is all this area. Close to 4 million square miles. It is larger than the United States of America, including Alaska. It's huge. That's why I can never figure out why property costs in Toronto are so high. That's very interesting. In this country with so much space, they're all squeezed into these little enclaves. Like Australia in that respect. The area is bounded obviously by the Atlantic Ocean on the east and the Pacific Ocean on the west. What describes Canada, obviously, is its latitude. Most of it is almost hostile to human habitation. To live on Baffin Island, I once met somebody who did, and they described life on Baffin Island. I mean, if you stick your nose out in the middle of January, just out the window or out the door, it's what? You have to go to the doctor. I mean, it's frozen. So it's a massive assault, if you will, on survival. Now, the first problem of Canada was to keep from getting conquered by the United States of America. And it successfully did it, not because of the Canadians, it did it because of the British. It was part of the British Empire, and the British Empire was the largest land empire in the world, and it under no circumstances was prepared to surrender Canada to the revolutionaries. So it survived. But Canada has suffered all these other problems, you see, and it's a very problematic country, which makes it a very interesting country if people would only pay attention. First, Canada is like Belgium and many other countries in the world. It had, from the beginning, two nations living in it that hated each other. One were the French, who were the original Europeans. And now I'm excluding, there were other nations. There were Amerindians, there were what? Eskimo Inuits, I mean, obviously. But in terms of the awareness of the population, there were two nations. One were the original French, and then opposing them, their conquerors were the English. And the tension between the two has been the continuing story of Canada. You can write all the pamphlets you want about Canadian unity and how all Canadians are one nation, and I get all this thing. I get the pamphlets. The point is, it's not true. There is a very deep division in the country. And in fact, it most likely is true that people in Ontario have an easier time relating to people in Michigan than they have relating to people in Quebec. Just because they're in the same political entity doesn't mean it necessarily works. And then, for the English Canadians, who are the overwhelming majority, some 80% of Canada, when I say English Canadians, I mean Canadians who've ended up speaking English. They may have spoken Ukrainian, do you understand? They may have spoken something else, but they ended up speaking English. For the 80%, their question is, how do you tell the difference between an English-speaking Canadian and an American? Well, you say. One says aboot, and the other one says about. One of the continuous frustrations that English-speaking Canadians have when they travel is that nobody can tell the difference. I mean, in order to tell the difference, they have to wear a large Canadian flag. Do you understand? Because If they spoke BBC English, had they given up the English they were speaking in North America? After all, the founding Englishmen of Canada came from the American colonies. They didn't speak what we would call BBC English. For most people listening to them who are foreigners, they can't tell the difference between American English and Canadian English. They can tell the difference between American English and what we call British English. They can't tell the difference. So if you're in a separate country, how do you distinguish yourself? What makes a Canadian different from an English-speaking American? It's been one of the great struggles. The third, of course, was that what gave Canada importance, when I was a child, in Windsor there flew a flag, the Union Jack. Remember the Union Jack? It was the flag of Great Britain, and it was the flag that flew all over Canada. Canada was part of the British Empire, so what was very important to Canada was, if people said, you're a nothing country, got a few million people, it's all frozen around here, got it? Who are you? Canadians would answer, certainly back in 1850 or 1860. We are part of the British Empire, and the sun never sets, do you understand, on the British Empire. How can you compare this little nothing United States to the British Empire? It gave them identity. It gave them pride. That's who they were. That's what they were. And then the British made a colossal mistake. They lost their empire. I mean, they couldn't hang on to their empire. So now this empire is falling apart. The English can no longer maintain it. So what's left of your identity? Who are you? One of the problems of Canada was always population. It was easy to persuade people to move to the United States. The economy was dynamic, and the climate was tolerable, generally, even in Detroit. But Canada was like a major frozen what? Waste. I mean, there's an area in Canada where the weather is tolerable. It lies south of the Ottawa River. It's this little thing that projects into the United States of America. The rest of it is what? And maybe Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. It's cold. It's an overwhelming challenge, I want to tell you. The consumption of energy by the average Canadian is greater than that of the average American. Do you know why? They got to stay warm. I mean, do you understand the amount of energy required just to stay warm? Even Inuits now in their igloos have central heating. I mean, the point is, it's a major challenge. And then in recent years, one of the challenges of the Canadians, you see, is how to relate to the United States of America, because after all, in order to survive, once the British Empire declined, there was no possibility that if the United States of America wanted to take Canada, that they couldn't take Canada, right? It'd be easy, right? Cross the border, no Canadian force could what? Resist it. So in the end, Canada was forced to cooperate, to be obsequious, to pretend to be nice, because otherwise there was no chance for survival. But then you get tired of that, and now America gets a government. The government is under President George Bush Jr. And in fact, he says to the Canadians, who he expects always to be cooperative, he says, I'm conducting a war in Iraq, and you're either for me or against me. What's your choice? Well, he knew what answer to expect. The answer, of course, we're always with you. We're always with you. We need tourists in Stratford and Shaw Festival. No, yes, no, we're with you. But what happened was the opposite. It's part of the crisis of Canada. I mean, the Canadians looked at the United States of America and said, no. 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 Americans were never used to hearing that answer from the Canadians. What do you mean saying no? That's problematic. And the only way that Canada can work is it has to have a strong central government. Because without a strong central government, the tension between the English and the French and whatever is so great that it can't function. And for many years it enjoyed that. There were great figures. Most of them were English Canadians. Some of them were French Canadians. There was MacDonald, who was like the first Prime Minister of the United Canada. There was Wilfrid Laurier. He was one of them. And there was the man I remember from my childhood, who was like Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He never lost an election. He was just the continuing ruler of Canada. His name, he was an interesting bachelor. His name was Mackenzie King. Some of you may remember Mackenzie King. I always associated him. I thought he was the permanent ruler of Canada. But what you had were viable central governments. But right now, the central government is sort of collapsing into chaos. And that's the reason why Canada has been chosen as a hotspot. Do most Americans know that? No, because whenever they see the word Canada in a headline, they what? They turn the page. Well, in order to tell you about the present crisis, to tell you about what's happening in Canada, I have to tell you the story of Canada. And let me just start the story with, obviously, the first people who came there. They came from Asia. They're called the Amerindians. And in fact, the Amerindians of Canada correspond to the Amerindians of the United States of America, because the boundary of Canada is artificial. The natural boundaries in North America go north and south. Got it? The Rockies are a boundary, aren't they? That goes what? It should go east and west, but it doesn't go east and west. It goes north and south. Then you got the prairie. Well, the whole prairie area, is there like a big mountain right in the middle there? No, it's just the what? There's the whole, it's north and south. So everything runs north and south. Those are the natural divisions of North America. And what has happened is that when the Amerindians came, that's how they divided. There were the coastal Amerindians. They didn't know about a boundary here. There wasn't any. There were the prairie ones, right? Same group. And then over here in the east, there were the woodland Indians, most of whom belonged to a group, whether they were in Michigan or Ontario, it's the same group. They're called Algonquin Amerindians, and in fact, they stretched all the way north almost to the Arctic, but in the Arctic area, there was another Asian group that had come across from Siberia. We used to call them by a word that is now politically incorrect. So when you ask for art in Ontario, never ask for Eskimo art. Do not use that word. It is absolutely not kosher. The new word, and you have to train yourself for it, because the word Eskimo is just part of my what? My vocabulary. The new word, I'm cautioning you, is Inuit. I-N-U-I-T. That is the word they prefer to be called by. And the Inuits were not Amerindians. They belonged to a what? Another group, a group adapted to, do you understand, the far, far, far north. They were there. Well, the second entry came from Europe. They were the French. They sailed up the St. Lawrence at the beginning of the 17th century. In the 16th century, an explorer called Jacques Cartier came there, but nothing happened after him. But at the beginning of the 17th century, Samuel Champlain, whatever, came in to the area and established the colony of what we call Canada today. And in fact, the French were to remain there, bringing settlers between 1608 and their departure in 1763. All right, so between that period of time, about 100,000, not a lot. One of the reasons why there weren't a lot was that the French decided to build the economy of Canada not on agriculture, which was problematic in the climate anyway. They decided to build it on fur. Well, you don't need a lot of people to what? To catch the furry animals. Do you understand? You can use the Amerindians for that. They bring it to the fort, then you buy it, then you what? You transport it and you sell it. So the French population was never large. One of the major forts under the French, of course, was Fort Detroit. The third entry, of course, was the coming of the English or the British, because a lot of the people who came were not only English, they were Scots. They were the great merchants. And in fact, the French had already established two major cities. One was called Quebec and one was called Montreal in Lower Canada. The British came, they took it, they settled there. The Scots merchants came, and that's why if you go to Montreal, some of the most important institutions in Montreal are named after Scots, including the university that everybody wants to go to, which is called McGill. So the Scots are very important. The reason why we say in Windsor, aboot, instead of about, is not because of the English. We say that because all the Scots came to Canada. They were part of what we would call the British invasion, the British arrival. Now, when the British came back in 1760, they created what is called British North America, which stretched all the way from the Arctic Ocean to the tip of Florida. It's called the First British Empire, and in fact, Canada was joined. But the British had a problem, and this is very important. In the colonies they had created, they didn't have this problem because there were virtually no Catholics except in Maryland. But they now took French territory, and the French were overwhelmingly Roman Catholic, and the Catholic religion was outlawed in England. So they made a compromise. It's very interesting. They made a deal with the church. The deal they made with the church was that they would, if the church leaders cooperated, and they were the major leaders of the people since the secular leaders had been defeated, if the church cooperated, the British would grant them toleration, the rights to control the education of their children and whatever. So a deal was made. A deal was made between the leaders of the French, who were the clergy, and the English, which remained one of the reasons why the French did not want the Americans to take Canada. You think they would to defeat the British, right? One of the reasons was they knew that if the Americans came, since they were all raving Protestants, that they would in some ways assault the privileges of the Roman Catholic Church, which had been granted by the British government, and all of that was reinforced by the French Revolution. When the French Revolution took place a few years later in France, the French disestablished the Roman Catholic Church, the revolutionaries. So now the French in Quebec or in Canada weren't so sure they wanted to return to France because it had a revolutionary government. So a kind of an alliance was made between the British and the leaders of the Roman Catholic Church in Canada. It was to make Canada a viable possession for the British. The next, of course, was the American Revolution, which split British North America. The southern part became the United States of America, and the northern part was now basically two colonies. Nova Scotia, which had been taken by the British already back in 1748, and Canada, and a huge area. Most of what today we call Canada was owned by a corporation. It was a fur trading corporation. You run across its department stores when you go to Canada. It's called Hudson's Bay. They owned, I'll tell you what they owned. They owned all of northern Quebec, all of northern Ontario, all of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, the Northwest Territories, the whole thing. They most likely owned 3 million square miles, because those GM was to own Montana, Utah, Colorado, whatever it was. And they had privileges of managing the fur trade that was there. So between Canada and Nova Scotia was to break up into three colonies, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island, and Canada, and Hudson's Bay Territory. There was still a vast territory left in the north to the British, most of it undeveloped, which was called British North America. But what happened was, and I referred to it, close to 50,000 Americans, Englishmen who thought themselves to be American Englishmen, crossed the border as refugees and became the founding English population of Canada. How do these people feel about the United States of America? They hated it, even though they were ethnically related and religiously related. They hated it. It was the enemy. When you cross over to Windsor, they don't have the Daughters of the American Revolution. The D-A-R that won't let Marian Anderson sing in their hall. You've got the Daughters of the Empire. You have all those people whose ancestors were the loyalists, who fought for their king, do you understand? Who remained loyal to their government. So their vision of the American Revolution is entirely different. This was the founding race of Canada. Well, the next is what we call the development. The British now have this place. It's very clear the Americans want it. The only way to keep the Americans from taking it is to bring people. So they put advertisements in all these British newspapers. And the poorest people decide to emigrate. The poorest people in Britain are Scots. They come out of the Highlands, they come out of the Lowlands, I don't know where they come from. I mean, they're coming out. John Galbraith wrote a book. He was born in Western Ontario. He wrote a book about the Scots in Ontario, the Canadian Scots. They're incredible. I love going to Stratford and to Shaw Festival, because my favorite thing, which I don't eat too often, are those butter tarts. Do you know the butter tarts? Does anybody know those Scottish butter tarts? Oh, they are absolutely. Anyway, the whole thing. And the Scots were into education. They built schools and hospitals and whatever it was. I mean, they poured into Canada. Most of them didn't stay in lower Canada. In Quebec, they moved on to Ontario. And Ontario is now filled, you understand, with Europeans. They're the Scots. If they hadn't populated the place. In 1838, they sent a surveyor by the name of Lord Durham. He's not a surveyor with an instrument. I mean, he was a nobleman, to see what they could do about the English-French problem. Durham came up with a solution, which was the policy of the English government from 1838 until 1867. The policy is, and Durham said, I've noticed that many of the natives are speaking French. That is intolerable. What we need to do is to persuade them to speak a civilized language. That language is English. In that way, we will preserve the unity of this colony and prevent the Americans from taking it. So there now was instituted a policy whereby Quebec and Ontario were merged. And the policy of anglifying the population went on, but it failed. What did work was the economic development. What failed was the attempt to merge the English and French by forcing the French to speak English. In case we're self-righteous about problems, we should recognize that in California we have a what? No, it's a similar problem. In the end, are we going to compel all the Spanish-speaking people who cross the border from Mexico to give up Spanish as their first and major language, I don't know. But there it is. And then, after the Civil War, America was really mad. So the Canadians are really afraid. Lincoln was assassinated, but now there's all this talk in Washington. They got this big army left over from the Civil War. What to do with it? March north! So in response to it, the British government decides to merge all the British colonies into one dominion. Canada, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and they merged them into a single country on July 1st, 1867, which was called the Dominion of Canada, a self-governing colony of such size that it wasn't called a colony, it was called a dominion, but at the head of the dominion was the Queen of England. Her name was Queen Victoria. And then in 1869, the Dominion of Canada, wanting to prevent the Americans from moving into the Northwest, purchased the whole territory of the Hudson Bay Company, now creating, next to Russia, the largest country in the world. It was fairly empty, but there it was. It was all in defiance of the United States of America. And the Dominion of Canada was created in response to the danger that was felt after the Civil War. The thing is coming together, and they find fairly extraordinary leadership. But now, having created this political entity, how were they going to make it work? Actually, in 1871, another British colony, which had nothing to do with Canada, which was founded along the Pacific, which was called British Columbia, decides to join the Federation. So now how do you make this country work? If British Columbia is part of Canada, how do you send a message from Canada to British Columbia? In order to make this country viable, you have to build an infrastructure of roads and railroads. Otherwise, it's what? Not going to work. At this time, the United States was building the Union, remember the Union Pacific? They were working on this whole thing to connect New York and San Francisco. And now it was proposed that the only way to make Canada work was to build a railroad. So they did. Actually, they built two railroads ultimately, but the first, which crossed the Canadian Pacific, went all the way. You could go from Montreal all the way ultimately to Vancouver in British Columbia. And they moved through really problematic area because construction in the winter in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, can you imagine building? But they built it. Now that's what defined Canada. If you look at where Canadian people live, most of them are within a few miles of the railroad. In Quebec, even if you look at northern Ontario, and if you go across Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia, the settlements all follow the railroad. The railroad helped to create and to unify Canada. It was a major, major feat. And then they invited thousands and thousands of more people to come. They had to fill up the spaces. They kept advertising in Scotland, but there weren't any. The Poles and the Slavic States of America, some Germans ended up in East used to be popular in the West. Now you had the railroad, right? You put them on, in Montreal, you put them on, they arrived in Saskatchewan. You would all came to Canada, uh, bigger, the United States to ship it. the